Thank you all for coming, and good evening. I'm Douglas Dewey. I'm Executive Director of the Wethersfield Foundation, and thanks especially for braving the summer storm for coming out. And I hope nothing happened to the train. There were about 15, 17 other guests, so we were going to be really full. So thanks for coming, and you're going to be very glad that you did. I've read the speech in advance, and I was elated with it, so I'll say no more. I also wear another hat, which is the sister organization of the Wethersfield Foundation, founded by Chauncey Stillman, the creator of everything you see here, in 1984 for the diffusion of Catholic culture and thought. And it is in that capacity that we're very proud to co-sponsor with the National Civic Arts Society this lecture with Catesby Leigh. Catesby, I think many of you are familiar with his work, is a noted art and architecture critic. His work has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, and National Review, and the City Journal, and the Claremont Review of Books, in First Things, one of my favorite publications, who have also done events here with us at Wethersfield. And I want to say that, just a word about NCAS, and you speak a little bit about it in your talk, that they were founded in 2002 to both promote the beautiful and oppose the ugly. And you have to do both, really, because beauty has a meaning, and we're going to hear about that this evening. Notably, they have opposed a very controversial design for the Dwight D. Eisenhower Memorial in the National Capitol Mall. And I don't know what the end of that is going to be. There's still some in the air there, but they substantially changed a lot of the most controversial and many of the Eisenhower family were strongly opposed to it. But at any rate, it was led by NCAS, its president, Justin Schuba. And on the promotion side, Justin is president of a marvelous, and I hope not quixotic, movement in New York City to rebuild Penn Station, a magnificent original Penn Station. Some of you may have seen ads, and they even have a 3D rendering of it and a model. There's some really important reasons beyond simply having a better station. We all know what was replaced on top of that architectural masterpiece in the 60s. We know what's there now. But it speaks to what New Yorkers experience and how they feel about what we are. And it's not merely about a station, a terminus that works better. And some of that is going to be touched upon by Catesby as well. So just about Chauncey Stillman, his life was a love affair with the true and the good and the beautiful. And what you see at Wethersfield is a grand proof statement of that, and in particular with the beautiful. And the beauty has a meaning. And if it didn't have a meaning, then, and as a result, it has opposites. It has things that are not beautiful, and we have to be able to see and say and know what that is. And I think we're going to hear about what is beautiful at Wethersfield. I don't think there's very much that is ugly. What is beautiful in Manhattan, and what is less than beautiful. So help me welcome Catesby Leigh. Thank you.
Thank you for the kind words, Douglas. And regarding the Eisenhower Memorial, I really don't have anything at all encouraging to report. It is a case that exemplifies what the National Civic Arts Society is trying to prevent. It's an architect inflicting his personal vision of what a presidential memorial could be, with a view to establishing his own reputation as a memorial designer. This is Frank Gehry, who's never designed a memorial before, and so he sort of reinvented the presidential memorial in a very, very extravagant way. And a very self-indulgent way. And it's so bad that it got very little positive critical feedback. And the powers that be in one of the those strange courses of events that aren't so uncommon in Washington, Gary wound up getting the indispensable backing of the senior senator from Kansas, Pat Roberts, who is a complete hayseed, and just thought that it would be great to have an Ike memorial by a celebrity architect, and so it's terribly unfortunate. Anyway, it's a great pleasure to be here, and as I was telling Mr. Stillman's daughter a short time ago, I had the pleasure of being here when I was about 10 years old, and came back after more decades than I care to admit a couple of months ago, and talked with Peter Butnick, Mr. Stillman's grandson, about doing a lecture that would put Wethersfield in a broader cultural context. But the great pleasure has been, I knew Mr. Stillman as a supremely benevolent figure of my youth, and saw more of him in New York than here. And he came to Washington some. He worked in Washington for a time, became a good friend of my parents. But it's just been an enormous pleasure to see the breadth and depth of what Mr. Stillman accomplished in returning here. And I'm very grateful to the Wethersfield Foundation for the opportunity to speak to you this evening. So, without further ado, Chauncey Stillman became enchanted with the Millbrook hunt country while fox hunting in this part of the world. But the dairy farm that became the Wethersfield estate did not present an enchanting spectacle when he bought it over 80 years ago. As Mr. Stillman's friend, the architecture historian Henry Hope Reed would write many years later, the land was taken up by, quote, scrubby, eroded fields. The hill, which the house now crowns, was, quote, a patchwork of cow pastures and, quote, bare, except for a small woodlot. Mr. Stillman purchased a wilderness of sorts, a noticeably degraded landscape in any event, and transformed it into something marvelous, though it should be noted that the estate still includes a working farm. In the wilderness garden he planted southwest of this house, his hunting trails eventually became horse carriage trails punctuated with statuary. That garden occupies the informal end of a spectrum of outdoor environments at Wethersfield that extends to the formal garden adjacent to the house itself. The formal garden, mostly laid out in the decades following World War II and mainly inspired by the Italian classical tradition, is a masterful creation that makes us feel at home in the world. After graduating from Harvard College, Mr. Stillman studied architecture at Columbia. The house and gardens represent collaborative efforts between Mr. Stillman and the designers he employed, principally the architects Bancel Lafarge and George Polar, and the landscape architects Evelyn Polar and Brian Lynch. The formal garden has a decidedly architectural character. Vistas are framed by trees and plants which were employed structurally, and in some cases, as with the arbor vitae framed allée leading to the Naiad fountain, at a monumental scale. The arborvitae here, as elsewhere in the garden, is undergoing restoration after suffering the ravages of decades of severe winter weather. The experience of enclosure in a variety of settings and at a range of scales instills a sense of well-being in the visitor that is as much physiological as intellectual. This skillfully orchestrated variety, in turn, is as much a hallmark of the formal garden as its axial layout. A principal east-west axis leads to and from the house. This is a westward view toward the house. It is intersected by two major north-south axes, one terminated by the Naiad Fountain and the other by a tempietto called the Belvedere, and several minor axes besides. These axes and the landmarks terminating them serve to orient us amid the multiplicity of spaces we encounter. The obelisks on the upper terrace's Peacock Walk serve a similar function. Statuary provides a figurative counterpoint to the garden's formal geometry. The statuary also enriches the landscape by introducing a poetic dimension, as do ancient architectural and decorative forms like the tempietto, the obelisks, and the numerous urns placed around the garden. Another realm of meaning emerged after Mr. Stillman's conversion to Roman Catholicism during the 1950s in works of religious sculpture, including this Madonna by the Polish-born Pittsburgh sculptor Joseph Stachura. Installed in the garden toward the end of Mr. Stillman's life, it terminates the vista down the beach tunnel, which abuts the inner garden on the east. The inner garden, English in style, was designed by Mr. Lynch around the time of the house's construction. It includes an arbor with hanging pots of plants that extends from the north wing of the house. Alongside the arbor runs an enchanting miniature canal or rill. The presence of sculpture, the water-spouting dolphins that produce a pleasant splashing sound, and amidst bursts of floral color, the female nude in sandstone by John Bernard Flanagan at the rill's north end, is typical of the Wethersfield Gardens. In the background here, we see a brick pavilion crowned by a grasshopper weather vane, the Grasshopper House, which stands at one end of the knot garden with its series of square flower beds framed by Arctic willow shrubs. Designed by Mrs. Polar, though the fine little flight of semicircular steps is Mr. Lynch's and the low bowls flanking them were designed by Stanford White, the beautifully proportioned and detailed knot garden instills a serene sense of harmonious enclosure. The effect, again, is physiological as well as intellectual. Turning to the Grasshopper House, we see it as there simply for our delight, with trompe-l'oeil decoration of the interior by Height Moore, in an exuberantly colorful manner akin to his Rococo treatment of the house's flower room, the main house's flower room. The interior includes an antique draped female torso, while Moore's cartouches frame scenes in grisaille inspired by Wethersfield, such as these two equestrians pausing next to a gigantic statue of a centaur. The inspiration came from Stachura's somewhat less gigantic centaur in the Wilderness Garden. As we proceed east, away from the house, we observe the formal garden's rich interplay between enclosure and openness. Looking south toward the reflecting pool, the near vista is framed by mounds of yew, but the vista is also open to the Taconic range in the distance. South of the pool, we can turn one way onto a beautifully framed curvilinear path to the cutting garden with a bucolic piper beckoning us in that direction, or we can turn to admire the valley view. Following the path, we discover that the piper is one of two arranged on a minor north-south axis, just one of many examples of the garden revealing its delights piecemeal. Turning 180 degrees, we encounter a superbly orchestrated vista, a complex array of plantings in which the natural contours of the trees provide a gorgeous backdrop for the geometric formality of the topiary. The variety of shades of green, a quality of the Wethersfield garden admired by Henry Reed, and the variously rounded, conical, and rectangular topiary forms play leading roles in this spellbinding scene. The turf path ahead curves to lead the visitor to the major north-south axis with the Naiad fountain at one end and the reflecting pool at the other. Off to the right, we can just make out the obelisk Peacock Walk. On the Peacock Walk, we again encounter an interplay between the elaborate garden landscape close to us and views into the distance. The elegant geometry of the garlanded flaming urns on the balustrade plays off the monumentally scaled cylindrical forms of the weeping beeches. At the far end of the Peacock Walk is a flight of steps aligned with the Belvedere. The path to which is marked not only by obelisks, but by hounds, and closer still to the Tempietto, putti. The shale and bluestone retaining wall beneath the Peacock Walk and its balustrade harbors a fountain with a cupid astride a dolphin. The sculpture is modeled on an Italian Baroque work in this room. It's actually right there. The fountain terminates another minor north-south axis. Instead of gravel, the ruddy paths you're seeing are strewn with red dog slag from steel mills. I'd like to close this brief look at Wethersfield Gardens by emphasizing a simple concept or quality that goes a long way toward defining its layout and aesthetic character. That quality is orchestrated complexity. Artistic tradition accounts for its presence no less than the obelisks, putti, or mythical figures like the goddess Diana. This formal quality of orchestrated complexity and the associated dimension of cultural memory don't just arise spontaneously. They are grounded in archetypes deeply embedded in Western civilization. The same applies, of course, to this beautiful room. With its magnificent architectural articulation of Portuguese pink marble with gilt accents, and Pietro Annigoni's evocations of Arcadia in the frescoed ceiling above us. The ultimate archetype in this tradition, as a quick glance around this room might suggest, is the human body. Its organic complexity, its harmonious integration of major and minor members, provide the formal basis for all design in the humanist tradition that coalesced in Greece and Rome. The assumptions underlying this tradition are flip sides of the same coin. On the one hand, the human body in its ideal state is taken to be the most beautiful of natural forms, while on the other, mankind is endowed with a particular cosmic significance as the point of intersection between the realms of matter and spirit, which unfortunately seem to be unacceptable, or at least deeply problematic assumptions in this day and age. But what brave new axioms and formal concepts have emerged after 80 years of upheaval in American art and architecture? Let us leave the countryside for the other end of the spectrum of human habitats, specifically Mr. Stillman's hometown of New York City, to see if we can find an answer. Before we do so, a few words about Wethersfield House. Mainly built in 1939 and 1940, the gloriette or highly decorated room we're in was added decades later. It is stylistically distinct from the grand Manhattan townhouses and apartment buildings Mr. Stillman was familiar with, nor is his Italian Renaissance garden the setting for an Italian Renaissance villa. The house's exterior was mainly designed in a vernacular Georgian idiom whose simple, dignified forms took root in the colonies well before the American Revolution and persisted until the eve of the Civil War. Its massing conveys a pleasing impression of organic growth over time, and its vernacular Georgian or colonial style is enriched with French doors as well as Regency accents like the bay windows and porch you see in this photograph. Here's the porch up to the
Hold on.
The sandstone front portico is, of course, Greek Revival. Wethersfield House reflects the temper of the period in which it was built. With the onset of the Depression, high classical magnificence went into eclipse for reasons both cultural and economic. Completed in 1929, the majestic Beresford apartment building on Central Park West is thus among the last of a breed. Wethersfield House, by contrast, is characterized on the whole by an understated elegance. Understatement not being a quality we would ascribe to the Beresford. But Mr. Stillman was hardly averse to splendor, as this gloriette attests. The superb edifice at 230 Park Avenue, in which he had his office for many years, formerly the New York Central Building, now the Helmsley, is one of Manhattan's more sumptuous and monumental skyscrapers. Also completed in 1929, it was designed by the architects of Grand Central Terminal. Wethersfield House, in sum, comes under the big tent of the classical architectural idiom, the principal idiom of the Humanist tradition, which is also home to historic styles ranging from the Gothic and Romanesque to the modern modes that shape buildings like the Empire State and Chrysler buildings. Wethersfield House, on the whole, might be said to be endowed with a domestic rather than monumental scale, this gloriette, again, being the exception. While the garden, and especially the arbor vitae wall enclosing the allée and the Naiad fountain, are likewise more emphatically monumental. Monumentality is not about size, though size can contribute to monumental effect. Monumentality is mainly about scale, and here again, this room serves as an excellent example. Our sense of monumentality is grounded in the scale of the human body. As a New Yorker with abundant knowledge of architecture, Mr. Stillman was inevitably aware of the monumental. And in New York, admittedly, there's no question size is very much a part of the monumental effect of many of its finest buildings. Yet the Racquet and Tennis Club, though larger than the Florentine palazzi that inspired it, is both smaller and more monumental than the skyscrapers surrounding it. Like its Italian prototypes, its ground level plays off the human scale, again, to monumental effect. At Foley Square, The New York State Supreme Court building with its august portico maintains visual order even amidst the chaos of automobile traffic. A little to the south, the municipal building's vast columnar screens serves as a powerfully monumental gateway on Chambers Street. Urban canyons created by Lower Manhattan's closely knit fabric of tall buildings themselves provide monumental settings, framing views of landmarks such as the New York Stock Exchange and Trinity Church at the head of Wall Street. Nor was it only modern styles that demonstrated the breathtaking aesthetic possibilities presented by new steel frame construction technology, as witnessed the aforementioned French classical Helmsley building or the soaring Flemish Gothic of the Woolworth building. Time after time, monumental New York richly rewards the upward gaze, whether with the American Eagle crowning the Bank of New York building on Wall Street, or Jules Coutin's Glory of Commerce Group crowning Grand Central South Front, perhaps the finest work of architectural sculpture in the United States, or the Theodore Roosevelt Memorial and its backdrop, the American Museum of Natural History. Of course, these monuments remain highly esteemed. The question is whether they retain a normative status as models and standards by which contemporary practice should be measured. For Mr. Stillman, the answer would have been yes, insofar as the prevailing elite dogmas and sensibilities of our day are concerned. The answer is obviously no. But what we must again ask has left us in the absence of the humanist tradition that was overthrown after the Second World War. What has replaced classicism's formal vocabulary, extending back in time for thousands of years, that was deemed obsolete even though it had always proved remarkably adaptable to changing social and technological conditions, creating countless buildings, landscapes, streetscapes, and public squares that have appreciated in value over the long term for the simple reason that they are loved. In looking for an answer, we might take a stroll along the High Line, a new linear park extending along an abandoned elevated freight railway on the far west side of Manhattan, and the eruption of high-end construction in the park's vicinity, for which the park's advent is partly responsible. The High Line extends for nearly a mile and a half from 34th Street and the rail yards west of Penn Station to Gansevoort Street and the new Whitney Museum of American Art. No overarching formal principle, such as orchestrated complexity grounded in the human figure, has shaped the treatment of the High Line landscape or the design of the architectural novelties in its vicinity. No metaphysical concept of mankind's place in the cosmic scheme of things is evident either. In fact, a kind of undeclared war against the metaphysical seems to be underway here, because little or nothing we see in the way of new work transcends nature, with a capital N, of course, or history with a capital H, or the self with a capital S. To be clear, I don't mean history in a normative sense as a repository of artistic achievements worthy of emulation, but history regarded as a succession of periods or events that can yield nothing better than a postmodern materialist's idea of progress. The highest aesthetic value in the cultural dispensation that has shaped the High Line panorama is authenticity, which pretty much boils down to the postmodern emotivist's notion of what is really real. The proposal to preserve the elevated freight line, which was threatened with demolition, emerged in the late 1990s and quickly generated reams of cultural buzz and financial backing, not only because of the picturesque views it unquestionably affords, but perhaps just as importantly, because the rail line itself is an industrial relic, and such industrial age riveted steel infrastructure is positively dripping with authenticity. Authenticity inheres, for instance, in the High Line's functional character. No frivolous decorative urns or obelisks here. The emphatically naturalistic planting aligns with the industrial authenticity vibe and mainly involves particular picturesque incidents that might be taken for accidents, in the sense that they are intended to convey the impression that the plants could have sprouted up naturally amidst the disused tracts and eventually overgrown them entirely. If the greenery seems a bit scruffy here and there, at least it isn't ugly, which is more than one can say for much of the new architecture. The northern segment of the High Line passes through the gargantuan mixed-use Hudson Yards development, billed as the largest private real estate development in the nation's history. Construction is now well underway, with the rail yards being decked over to make way for new buildings and parks. The complex already is being serviced by the extension of the number 7 subway line from Times Square. The titanic glassy pile that is 10 Hudson Yards looms over the linear park as one approaches the bend at 30th Street. At the bend, a multi-art venue called The Shed, which will open next spring, comes into view, and immediately after, another exotic structure dubbed The Vessel that will serve as an eye-catching lookout. What we see here reflects a relentless search for idiosyncrasy rather than an overall visual coherence. The entrance plaza to 10 Hudson Yards is about bigness. Its design is simply too crude to be considered monumental. Turning around and heading south to walk the High Line through Chelsea, rather than following it around the rail yards, the architectural cacophony continues unabated. We pass by a high-rise apartment building that exceptionally, if rather superficially, references pre-war residential architecture. We encounter speculative developments that are simply banal, along with what we might call fashion statement buildings. Iconic structures in whose design novelty seems to have been an end in itself, as with the horizontally striated cladding wrapped around this edifice, or the bizarre, hyper-expressionistic cladding on this one, or the weird morphology of this shimmering curiosity. Further along, we espy Frank Gehry's, I couldn't leave Frank Gehry out of this. We espy Frank Gehry's remarkably miasmic IAC corporate headquarters, which some might regard as appropriate for an internet and media holding company. Having scratched our heads over the possible evocation of the Viennese secession in the grid-framed glazing of this building, we have no doubt whatsoever about the derivation of the very ugly but ever so hip Standard Hotel and the bulky, exposed concrete stilts, or pilotis, as Le Corbusier called them, on which it is perched. The Standard is a brutalist building, Le Corbusier having pioneered this sculpturesque approach after the war as an expressionistic reaction against his own hyper-rationalist international style creations of the 1920s and 30s. Time was, as a lawyer friend of mine remarked, when brutalist would have been regarded as an epithet, but the style has made a comeback, and the authenticity tag has a lot to do with it. The High Line does provide glimpses of what we might call adult architecture. We're looking here at the London Terrace residential complex, which runs the entire block between 9th and 10th Avenues and fronts on 23rd and 24th Streets. It's not as grand as the Beresford, and in fact, construction got underway here shortly after the Great Crash of 1929, nor was it intended to house as prosperous a population. The point is that achieving an animated, harmonious variety within an overall unity in a project of such dimensions is a tall order. And there was a day when American architects were trained to do precisely that, back when we had an architectural culture worthy of the name. The landmark at the High Line's southern terminus is yet another idiosyncratic contraption, and quite a big one at that, the new Whitney Museum of American Art. You might have thought the architect, Renzo Piano, couldn't do worse than his Morgan Library edition, but here we are. Again, there is no humanist integration of major and minor volumes in this building. It is rather a forlorn expressionistic jumble of functional elements. The designer's overriding aim, it seems, was with inducing that sublime frisson of industrial strength authenticity. Despite its far more rational and less sculpturesque design, the same would apply to the monstrosity, the MetLife, formerly Pan Am building, that brutally upstaged Mr. Stillman's beloved 230 Park Avenue when it was topped off 55 years ago. The same barbaric indifference to the human scale is apparent when we approach the Hudson Yards development from the west. What we see in the middle here is the 10th Avenue front of a retail and restaurant emporium next door to 10 Hudson Yards, then closest to us, the 30 Hudson Yards Tower, now under construction. With the Whitney, the Hudson Yards megastructures, the MetLife skyscraper, authenticity is conceived in terms of a dehumanized sublimity. Again, no enduring formal aim has guided their designers, apart from the negation of the humanist tradition, which is what modernism, alas, pretty much boils down to. These dystopian structures also direct our attention to an important Aristotelian principle. The power to do something is also the power not to do something. Technology should be architecture's servant, its humanized servant. But so-called cutting-edge architecture is technology's slave, and that's why one can reasonably question whether cutting-edge architecture is really architecture at all, rather than a matter of more or less deplorable exercises in structural pyrotechnics. The structural freak show we experience along the High Line is complemented by its art display. As you might expect, the harmonious interplay between figurative sculpture and the abstract geometries or naturalistic contours of trees and shrubs that we encounter at Wethersfield is not one of the linear park's more conspicuous features. The High Line's temporary art installations bear witness instead to our emotivist elite culture, in which one person's opinion as to what art is as good as another's, so long as it is politically and culturally correct. And by culturally correct, I mean antithetical to the humanist canon. The art along the High Line doesn't rely on its formal content as a rule, because that content is far too exiguous to justify its creation. Each artwork needs to be propped up by a theory or narrative, a phenomenon Mr. Stillman's late friend Tom Wolfe skewered in a fine little book, The Painted Word, back in the mid-1970s. These, fortunately, biodegradable lumpen forms, mainly composed of cement and clay, which I encountered 3 summers ago, might not appear to be art at all, just some baffling industrial relic. In fact, the series of which they form part is, or was, entitled The Evolution of God. We'll just leave it at that. This work by an African-American artist, which stood near the standard, is entitled Blobs, and was billed in the accompanying commentary as, quote, a reflection on blackness. When I passed by the standard a couple of months ago, I encountered this illuminated sign, whose other side reads, "We are 11 million," and of course references the bitter and seemingly interminable immigration controversy. Another hot-button political issue is referenced by this neon sign. That's right, spelled R-I-G-T, turn for reparations. Again, the work of an African-American artist. We encounter a series of minimalist teepees, mural paintings that play off the Statue of Liberty, or, it might appear, the Jetsons. A rebar confection entitled Physical Graffiti. A British sculptor's baffling melange of industrial materials piled up on a now truncated and profusely planted railway spur that once led into a Nabisco refrigerated warehouse. The Chelsea Market building, through which the High Line passes, recently housed an installation of hundreds of panes of colored glass based on the changing tints of the surface of the Hudson River as photographed from a tugboat plying the waters in the High Line's vicinity. The park has even offered a satirical take on classical fountains with this artifact by another British artist entitled "To Employ the Mistress." It's a French toff thing. The most interesting artwork I've encountered at the park is this nearly 9-foot-long marble model of Manhattan Island created by a Japanese-born artist a decade ago. Its upper surface was billed as including every building, bridge, and pier then existing in Manhattan. Amenities along the High Line include the Diller von Furstenberg sun deck and water feature, where visitors can soak in some rays or soak their or their toddlers' weary feet. Then we have the 10th Avenue Square, a theater-like space looking down to glass panels affording a view up 10th Avenue. Here's the view from a point nearby. And further north, a capacious lawn and wooden bleachers. Some of the contrasts we experience along the High Line are a matter of design, as with this grove-like space. But with few exceptions, the most arresting contrasts we experience are not the result of art, as they are at the Wethersfield Gardens. They are supplied instead by the park's urban and natural surroundings, starting with the Hudson River. In contrast to Wethersfield, it's hard to see the High Line as entailing landscape architecture of a high order, though it's certainly been treated as such by many critics. As for the new buildings that have arisen along it, they are symptomatic of a profoundly dysfunctional status quo. Even more explicitly than the architecture, however, the art the park showcases testifies to the postmodern apotheosis of the self at the expense of any transcendent artistic aim, and at the expense, it goes without saying, of any objective standard of artistic competence. Identity politics figure very prominently in this dispensation, needless to say. The classical idea of a shared human nature seems terribly passé. To return to the question we raised as to what replaced the humanist canon, the answer provided by our Highline excursion seems to be very simple. Sheer visual anomie, evidently the fruit of intellectual and even spiritual anomie, to judge by the level of self-centeredness informing the art and architecture we encounter. So the views of and from this park, so far as the humanist prospect is concerned, aren't encouraging. Over the last 2 decades, postmodernism's formerly anything goes mindset has tended to become quite intolerant of traditional art and architecture. The status quo is maintained by prestigious media outlets, art and architecture departments at the overwhelming majority of our colleges and universities, by countless museum curators, by the American Institute of Architects, and by cultural bureaucracies involved with the commissioning of government buildings, historic preservation, percent for art programs, and official design review, especially in our nation's capital. There is a traditional artistic counterculture to which Mr. Stillman would have been quite sympathetic. In fact, he was a supporter of the organization Henry Reed co-founded, Classical America, which eventually merged with the Institute of Classical Architecture and Art, headquartered in New York City. This counterculture emerged with Classical America's foundation half a century ago. It now encompasses architecture, fine art, and under the banner of the new urbanism, community planning calibrated to the pedestrian rather than the automobile scale, and to regional architectural traditions rather than cookie-cutter post-war formulae, antithetical to the creation of a sense of place. With occasional exceptions, such as Robert Stern's 2 new collegiate Gothic residential colleges at Yale, this counterculture gets precious little media attention. Influential critics tend to be reflexively hostile to it. Many of them accept not only the equivalence of progressive design with progressive politics, but even a codependent relationship between the two. Partisan politics thus provides a theoretical, or at least sentimental, justification for ugly art and architecture. The aspiration to beauty, on the other hand, becomes inherently reactionary, and the contemporary classicist is easily written off as an Albert Speer wannabe. It is not always clear whether this crass confusion of art and politics is based on sincere conviction or cynical rationalization. The counterculture's marginal status is also partly attributable to photography and the internet. These days, buildings frequently are evaluated not after they are experienced in 3 dimensions, but on the basis of photographs or computer-generated renderings we see on our flat screens. This mode of perception encourages the perversely simplistic, literally 2-dimensional assessment of a given design on the basis of its iconic novelty. The design image that, when seen on the computer screen, packs a punch, no matter how ephemeral. The design image that implicitly issues a "can you top this" challenge to the competition has the advantage. It also empowers the postmodern critic by offering him or her the opportunity to assume a sort of divinatory role by providing exegetical validations of the latest architectural fads or artistic fads, much as ancient augurs read the entrails of sacred chickens. So when you see the word iconic, it's a pretty safe bet that that attribute arises from the mass propagation of photographic images of the work in question. Iconic also happens to be an essential term for the developers and marketers of real estate. These are not the kind of people who think about the long term in our day and age. Developers in particular are focused on an investment cycle, and where high-end construction is concerned, as at the Hudson Yards, on a concomitant fashion cycle, as opposed to the ongoing appreciation and value over many decades, even centuries, of what they build. Traditional architects thus confront a degraded culture of building geared to the production of commodities, whether eye-popping or banal, as opposed to artifacts of enduring value. The design and construction of buildings in historic styles that convey a sense of robust construction is a real challenge outside the realm of expensive houses, in which a lot of very good traditional work is being done for the record. High-rise projects are more difficult because the economics of modern frame construction typically mandates the use of skimpy veneers that easily convey an impression of insubstantiality or even cheapness, but not always. Here's a new apartment building on East 79th Street, designed in a modern idiom that, despite flawed handling of the fenestration, imparts a pleasingly monumental sense of mass, solidity, and scale. Perhaps we'll see high-rise office buildings conceived along these lines in the years ahead. Returning in conclusion to the West Side, it is home to New York City's most infamous eyesore, Pennsylvania Station, the busiest and quite possibly the most reviled transportation facility in the country. Construction of a new skylit train hall is now underway in the old Farley Post Office building across 8th Avenue from the existing station. But the latter, meaning the existing station, will continue to handle the bulk of the railway and mass transit passenger traffic. And even with the glitzy makeover Governor Cuomo plans for Penn Station itself, it will remain indecorously submerged beneath the drab cylindrical pile of Madison Square Garden and the cookie-cutter slab that is the 2 Penn Plaza office tower fronting on 7th Avenue. The solution is for the cylinder and the tower to come down and Madison Square Garden to move so that Charles Fallen McKim's majestic Pennsylvania Station, unconscionably demolished in the mid-1960s, can rise again as proposed by the architect Richard Cameron. It's hard to imagine a more salutary counterpoint to the architectural histrionics on view along the High Line. Reconstruction of McKim's masterwork is the aim of an important initiative mentioned by Douglas, launched by the National Civic Arts Society, which you can learn more about at rebuildpennstation.org. The rebuilt station would function not just as a transportation facility, but as the civic epicenter of an urban district extending north to Times Square, east to Herald Square and the Empire State Building, west to Hudson Yards, and south to Chelsea. It would also serve as a vibrant commercial venue. The station's reconstruction would undermine the reigning dogma that the design of a building can only express its time. On the contrary, the old Penn Station's general waiting room, whose reconstruction, as envisioned by Cameron, you're seeing here, was modeled on the baths of Caracalla in Rome. McKim's Penn Station was a building not of its time, but for all time. As for the notion that reconstruction would be inherently inauthentic, tell that to the people of Dresden, whose historic core, including the glorious Frauenkirche, rose from the ruins left by Allied firebombing early in 1945. For thousands of years, the humanist tradition has underlain the building of enduring value across the spectrum of human habitats, from countryside, as with the Wethersfield House and Gardens, to village and town, to suburbs and the big city. A new old Penn Station might just provoke much needed debate about how we should go about building more value into our world with a view to making ourselves at home in the world. Thank you.